All right. Welcome, Brian Lenardo, who is joining us from SLAC, where he's a Panofsky Fellow. Before that, was a postdoc at Stanford, working with Giorgio Grada. Worked on many projects, including NEXO, things on the Migdal effect, various solar neutrino studies, many of which he'll talk about in this seminar. So, with that,
Great. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so most of my time, well, first of all, it's great to be here. It's my first time at Yale. And it's really, it's exciting to be in Wright Lab. I've heard a lot about it and worked with a lot of folks in this room. So thanks for the invitation. So this talk is a little bit scattered. Most of my sort of day job has been doing NEXO stuff. I won't talk almost at all about NEXO in this talk, so it'll be a little bit scattered, but I think there's some fun stuff that I hope spark some questions. So obviously you start with the standard model. This is our theory of how fundamental particles interact with each other. It's extremely successful, really remarkable predictive power. The example that I like to give is the fact that you can calculate the electromagnetic moment to decimal places. So this is a really powerful theory of how the most elementary building blocks of our universe interact with each other. But of course, as everybody in this room is aware, it doesn't contain all of the features of nature that we observe. In particular, there's open questions about how our universe got filled with matter. What is dark matter? What is dark energy? So all of the interest in what we do is trying to discover what physics might lie beyond this to answer some of these deep questions. So looking at neutrinos is a particularly compelling place to look for new physics, because neutrinos, we already know they don't behave as one naively would expect from the standard model. So the first thing, of course, is that neutrino masses are non-zero. We know this from the phenomena, the observation of the phenomenon of neutrino oscillations, which tells us that the states in which neutrinos propagate across space, or which are states of definite mass, are not simultaneous eigenstates of the states of definite flavor. Which means that they must be distinct from each other. And so we have this picture of neutrinos where we know that at least two of them have non-zero masses. And we're still trying to understand how those masses are organized, and then also what the absolute scale of these masses is. The second thing that is unique about neutrinos is, of course, now we know they have mass, but we don't know what mass they are because we've tried to weigh them and haven't been able to observe any mass. If you plot the mass of neutrinos compared to the other particles in the standard model, or the other massive particles, the fermions, there's a 6th order of magnitude gap in the mass, the upper limits that we have of the mass of neutrinos and the lightest of the other particles. And so we have these two almost competing observations, which is that neutrinos are massive, but they're much, much lighter than all the other particles that we know about. So how would you give neutrinos mass in the standard model? They're unique in that they're not electrically charged, so you can actually give them mass in two different ways. The Dirac mass is the same type of mass mechanism that every other particle has. It's the mass generated through the Higgs mechanism. But because neutrinos are not charged particles, you can also give them Majorana mass terms. So this is sort of the most general, simplest way of expressing neutrino mass. What's exciting about this is that actually in both cases, it implies new physics. So in the case of the Dirac mass term, the way that the Higgs mechanism works is it couples states of different chirality or helicity. I get them confused, I'm sorry. But left-handed to right-handed states. The left-handed neutrinos are the ones that we know about. They interact through the weak interaction. But right-handed neutrinos, as far as we know, don't exist. We've never observed them at all. So giving a neutrino a mass through this mechanism implies the existence of particles beyond the standard model. In the other case, the Majorana mass term, there are no other particles in the standard model that get mass through this mechanism. It's a mechanism that's not the Higgs mechanism. So again, this implies new physics. There are some deep connections to some of the unsolved problems in particle physics. Of course, the implication of new particles introduces potentially new mass states, which could potentially explain the dark matter problem. I won't go into too much about that because there's some caveats there. But it does predict the existence of new particles that could lead to a deeper understanding. In the Majorana case, this could address some of the big, deep, unsolved problems and how we get a universe that's dominated by matter and not antimatter. So both of these are really important things to look for in trying to discover new physics. So what I'm hoping to pitch with this talk is that the atomic nucleus is really an excellent place to look for these types of deviations from the standard model. So I'll have three sort of separate topics that I'll try to cover. I may not get to everything because it's a little bit much, but you can use the nucleus as a target for understanding neutrinos. Neutrinos can scatter off the nucleus. You can also make precision measurements of radioactive decays that involve neutrinos to try and get some information about neutrinos. And then searching for lepton number violation with double beta decay is the best way that we have to try and understand the Majorana nature of neutrinos. So I'm going to start with talking a little bit about double beta decay. So neutrinoless double beta decay is a phenomenon where you can have a nucleus which decays through the simultaneous exchange of two neutrons to two protons, where that process emits two electrons and two antineutrinos. So this, as I'm drawing here, is what's just known as double beta decay. This is a perfectly allowed process within the standard model. And the way that you detect this process is you measure those two outgoing electrons. The two neutrinos will escape your detector and you'll never see them. So you measure this broad energy spectrum from the sharing of the energy between the electrons and the emitted neutrinos. Neutrinoless double beta decay is where instead of the neutrinos exiting the decay, the neutrinos can interact in the same diagram and sort of become a mediator of the decay. In that case, you only get two electrons out. All of the energy is given to those two electrons, so you get a monoenergetic peak right at the Q value of the decay. And this can only happen if neutrinos are Majorana particles. That type of interaction can only happen in that scenario. So in this case, you can tell sort of by eye that you're creating two leptons and no anti-leptons in the final state of this interaction. So it immediately demonstrates lepton number violation, immediately demonstrates the Majorana nature of neutrinos. So it's a really compelling place to look for new physics. We're doing these experiments in many different isotopes. Here I've just highlighted xenon because that's the one that I work on. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that in next. First, we need to understand how we extract information about new physics from the neutrinos double beta decay measurements that we make. So we're looking for this monoenergetic peak. The number of events that you see in that peak can be directly proportional to the half-life of that process. And so you can write down an equation that looks like this, where the inverse of the half-life is equal to three terms, one of which is a coefficient which encodes the new physics that you're looking for, whatever physics is mediating that decay. There's a phase-space factor that you can calculate. And then there's a nuclear matrix element, which in principle you can calculate, although nuclear physics is hard. So there's a lot of uncertainty here. But basically, you make this measurement and you try and extract this information. So in the most common model of how this decay happens, you get an exchange of the light known neutrino states, but they're Majorana, so they interact through this diagram here. In this scenario, that new physics parameter becomes an effective mass of the neutrinos, which is some of the known neutrino mass states. This parameter, which we call M beta beta, encodes the new physics. And so when you do these experiments and you look for a half-life, you can set limits on that parameter in this space here. So this is a plot. It's sort of how we quantify the sensitivity of these experiments. You have the new physics parameter on the y-axis. You're constraining it from above. And then on the x-axis is the still unknown absolute mass scale of neutrinos, here written as the lightest mass state. The blue and the red regions are the allowed regions of the parameter space. So experiments are constraining this from above and starting to cut into the blue region of the parameter space. And in the next generation are hoping to completely cover that and start to cut in deeper to the red region of the parameter space. So the strongest current limit comes from Kim Lansen. I'm actually not going to talk too much about double beta decay experiments. Instead, I'm going to pivot to how nuclear physics, or bread and butter nuclear physics, can play a role in these types of experiments. So in the first case, you can actually use detectors that look for neutrinos double beta decay also as neutrino detectors. So this has been studied as far back as like the 80s and 90s. But the idea here is that in double beta decay experiments, you have a scenario where the binding energy the neighboring nucleus of the specific isotope that you're looking at is actually higher. So you cannot get single beta decays, but you can only get double beta decays. So that's by design in these experiments, you use these types of isotopes. But if you are now capturing neutrinos on that nucleus through charged current interactions, this means you have a very low threshold for that charged current interaction, and therefore can use this as a low threshold technique for detecting neutrinos. This was pointed out by this guy, Raju Raghavan, and who specifically pointed out that double beta decay isotopes are really good as neutrino detection isotopes because of the nuclear structure physics at play here. So what we've been working on is expanding the physics program of these double beta decay experiments, specifically focused on xenon, trying to understand how well they can act as neutrino detectors. And so what's really exciting about this is that the neutrino can interact on the nucleus. You essentially induce beta decay, so you get an electron out in the final state. But in general, this is not going to go directly to the ground state, but it's going to go to excited states in that nucleus. So you will also get gamma rays that come out of that interaction, which are characteristic of the nucleus that you create in the final state. And so if you can tag the presence of that final state nucleus through measurements of those gamma rays, then you can essentially reject all of your background and do background-free measurements of low-energy neutrinos. So what's specifically exciting about several of these isotopes, but xenon and cesium, is that in cesium-136, it's predicted that you have the primary interaction gives you an energy deposit in your detector, but then that excited state lives for a reasonably long time, and so you would get a delayed gamma ray. So you'd see a time coincidence signal that allows you to do this background suppression and look for these neutrino interactions with very low backgrounds. So what could you do with this? Well, we wrote a paper a few years ago talking about how you could do background-free measurements of solar neutrinos. Specifically, we were interested in trying to detect the CNO neutrinos, which come from a process of one of the fusion processes in the center of the sun that are notoriously hard to understand and could provide insight into the metallicity of the solar core. And then also you could do background-free searches for certain models of dark matter that would interact through this charged current-like process. So there's some rich physics that you could potentially do in these next generation double beta decay experiments if you can observe these interactions. The question that we were faced with is that when we started working on this, the nuclear structure of cesium-136 was predicted, but wasn't well known experimentally. So we predicted that there was some delayed coincidence that you could use for background suppression, but we needed to demonstrate it experimentally to show that this would actually work. So this is a bread and butter nuclear physics experiment where you measure the level structure of a nucleus. So myself and my buddy Scott, who also works on big xenon detectors, and our Nexo collaborator, Tim Daniels, teamed up with a group at Duke who are experts in making these sorts of nuclear structure measurements. And so we went to tunnel and made some measurements. The measurements look like this. In our case, we had a beam of protons impinging on a xenon-136 gas cell, and that proton interacted with the nucleus. A neutron was emitted in the final state, turning the xenon into cesium in excited states. And then we have gamma ray detectors around here to make measurements of those gamma rays that are emitted and try and reconstruct the level structure of this isotope that we're interested in. So this is a picture of the experiment. There was a proton beam coming in. The target looked like this. It was a little tiny gas cell with a pressure monitor to make sure there was still gas in the cell. We put that in the beam and then had some gamma ray high purity germanium detectors to measure the outcoming gamma rays. So with these data, we were able to reconstruct the level scheme relevant for neutrino detection in experiments like Nexo, and indeed showed that there's actually two excited states in this nucleus with long lifetimes. So we were able to measure the time profiles of those two states and show that this tagging is actually possible. So what's next? So now we have experimental confirmation that we could do this. So Glenn, who's sitting right here, has now for the last year or so been working on simulations of how this would actually look like in Nexo and what our sensitivity would actually be to CNO, solar neutrinos, dark matter, and other signals. And so here you see simulations that Glenn produced of what the scintillation signals in Nexo would look like if you were to have these interactions. And you can see very clearly, you would see this delayed coincidence signal and be able to discriminate these from backgrounds. So the projection based on these simulations is that you could reject background at a factor better than 10 to the 8, really making this a background-free measurement of neutrinos. So here's some very preliminary results. We have on this plot, as a function of the timing resolution of your photosensors, because that's a sort of design parameter that we need to build into the detector, the statistical precision that you could get on the CNO-neutrino flux. This line here is the measurement that was produced by Borexino, which is a dedicated solar neutrino experiment. And here we're projecting that under different assumptions about the metallicity in the solar core, you could get comparable precision to dedicated solar neutrino experiments. So this is really exciting, a completely independent detection channel, and essentially a measurement that we think you could get for free in a double beta decay experiment. Likewise, you can look for what we call fermionic dark matter. This is this specific model of dark matter that interacts through these charge current interactions. And with this powerful background rejection, we could improve on existing limits by, in some cases, about 4 orders of magnitude. So really powerful background for each searches for these two types of signals. So the other thing that I've been interested in for a while is actually going back to the double beta decay. How can you use nuclear physics to address some of the key systematic uncertainties in these experiments? So in particular, this matrix element that we talked about, which plays into how you translate a half-life into new physics, is extremely uncertain because nuclear physics calculations are really hard for nuclei that have lots of nucleons. You have to do these many body calculations of each one interacting with each other one. And so the calculation blows up and you have to make approximations that then create uncertainties. And so here's an example. You see, this is that matrix element on the y-axis. 136 is the xenon isotope that I use in our experiments. And different predictions using different models of the nucleus have vastly different predictions for that matrix element, which then when you square it, translates into this order of magnitude uncertainty in what the experimental results actually say about constraints on new physics. So if we can narrow that uncertainty down, that could really make us more robust at understanding how well experiments constrain the Majorana nature of neutrinos. So in particular, why this is exciting today is that there's been a lot of work in the theory community addressing this. There's these new ab initio techniques where they sort of take first principles calculations of the nucleus without using these models to approximate them and can produce matrix element predictions that have dramatically smaller uncertainties than that spread in the nuclear models that we saw in the previous slide. So this is a plot that was from Antoine Belli's thesis. And the point here is that by moving to these ab initio techniques, we potentially have a path towards matrix elements with reduced uncertainties and quantifiable uncertainties. So what, as an experimentalist, can we do to help out this effort? And so in the last few years, we've been thinking about, are there nuclear observables that can probe the relevant physics and sort of benchmark these calculations so that when somebody gives you a number with a small error bar, you can be confident that it's correct. And so you can ask the question, are there observables that you can measure in the lab that correlate with the matrix elements in a special way? Are there observables that probe the same sorts of interactions, the weak interactions at the momentum transfer scales that are relevant for double beta decay, which is sort of 100 MeV, which is a little bit hard to do in the lab sometimes. And then testing the ground state wave functions of these nuclei that are relevant for double beta decay to understand how, is the model correctly predicting the overlap between these two states, the initial and final state. So the experiments that we did with cesium 136, it turns out may actually be useful for some of this. There are experiments ongoing that use what's called ordinary muon capture to probe nuclear physics at the momentum scales relevant for double beta decay. The way that this works is you start with the final state in double beta decay. Here's an example of germanium to selenium double beta decay, but this is true generically. So double beta decay would take you from this nucleus to this nucleus, but you can also capture muons on this nucleus and populate excited states in the intermediate nucleus. And that's an experiment that tests the weak interaction at up to very high energies very readily. So the way that you do this is you make these measurements, you do muon capture, you measure how often that muon capture populates specific excited states in the intermediate nucleus, and then you compare that to the theoretical calculations. And that gives you a benchmark of how well the theory is doing. The issue is that now you need to know the level structure of that intermediate nucleus in order to interpret the results from that experiment. So our experiments measuring the level structure of cesium-136 could immediately be applied to these types of experiments and interpret the gamma ray spectrum that they observed, trying to back out the transition strengths in this decay. So what we were able to do with our data is build a level structure up to roughly one MeV. That's not quite high enough. We'd like to go up to 3 MeV. We don't have those data yet, but we're sort of thinking about how we do follow-up experiments. Yeah.
Can I?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, sorry. Can you go back on the previous one? Apologies. I think I'm missing on the connecting bit of, I guess the theory aspect that you can take from the 76 arsenic, I guess. To go back to neutrinoless double beta decay in theory,
So yeah, the connection is not, it's not like a direct connection. What you do is you measure the transition strength from the muon capture to populating specific excited states.
Yeah.
And then you ask your theorist buddy to calculate that.
Yes.
And then how well they agree gives you some constraints on how well the theory is calculating these two nuclei.
For the nuclear matrix elements?
So that's it's not the double beta decay matrix element directly, but basically if you get good agreement up to high energies, you can say, okay, well now I trust this theory calculation when I use it to calculate the neutrinos double beta decay matrix element.
Okay, thanks.
Another important input that we've started working on recently is nuclear deformation. So the nucleus, as you get up to larger nuclei, the ground states and the sort of the excited states can actually not be spherical. They can take on intrinsic deformation. And so this is sort of illustrated here. The simplest deformation is a quadrupole deformation of the nucleus, where you can parameterize it with two parameters, this beta, which is the amount of deformation, and the gamma, which tells you whether you're sort of football shaped or squished to the oblate formation. And what's important is that for nuclear matrix elements, it's been shown in theoretical calculations that if you have deformation in the initial and final nuclei, and especially if you have different deformation in those two nuclei, there's less wave function overlap. And so it suppresses the matrix element. So this is a plot for the xenon to barium system of this magnitude of deformation parameter. And this is the magnitude of the matrix element. And you can see that basically as you move away from the 0, point, the matrix element gets smaller. This is omitted in many of the nuclear models just to make calculations more tractable. It's hard to calculate deformed nuclei, but it's important if it really impacts the magnitude of these numbers because we use that to translate experimental results into new physics. So we would like to measure this in the relevant nuclei so that we have an input when we do the theory calculations that we can plug in the deformation. I'm not sure that's exactly how it works, but yeah, experimental results are helpful in this context. So the way that you do this is through experiments called Coulomb excitation experiments, where you have a nucleus that scatters off of the target nucleus of interest, but you shoot that with low enough energy that it doesn't actually strike that nucleus. It only interacts through the Coulomb interaction. So it doesn't quite get close enough for the two nuclei to like collide in a sense, but through the exchange of photons, you can excite states in the target nucleus. And those specific excitations in the Coulomb interaction are selective of quadrupole transitions in the nucleus. And so as you make these measurements and you measure those transition strengths, you can back out the intrinsic quadrupole deformation of the nuclear state. So it's a little bit complicated, but basically you start in the ground state, this projectile excites different states and you measure all of these excitation matrix elements and then use that to construct rotational invariance of the nucleus and back out the deformation of the state. So this has been done, really impressive bunch of experiments have been done in germanium-76, which is one of the nuclei important for double beta decay. So what we're proposing is we want to do this in barium-136, which is one of the nuclei that's important for xenon double beta decay experiments. So in particular, in this particular isotope, there are disagreeing measurements in the literature right now. So if we can nail this down, we think it'll be helpful for calculating matrix elements in this isotope. So we have experiments, some preliminary experiments approved at the heavy ion laboratory at the University of Warsaw. We're hoping we can run those experiments this coming autumn. With low Z beams, you want to do these experiments with a variety of different nuclei to give you a handle on some of the systematics and on the excitation. So we'll do some low Z experiments and then hope to, in the future, do high Z experiments at a place like National Lab. Okay, so that's my spiel on double beta decay. Now I'm going to move on to neutrino physics with low energy nuclear recoils. So this is now moving from lepton number violation to double beta decay to using the nucleus as a target for neutrino scattering and using that to search for interesting physics. So in particular, I work on low threshold xenon detectors looking for detecting coherent elastic neutrino-nucleus scattering, or CEvNS. And so this is an interaction where a neutrino at low enough energy, say in the 10 MeV and below regime, scatters coherently off the entire nucleus. So what that means is that the cross-section for that interaction is actually much larger than all the other neutrino interaction channels. And so it's potentially a very useful tool for studying how neutrinos interact. So this is possible for relatively low energy neutrinos, actually maybe below 100 MeV. You get this enhanced cross-section, which is very exciting. It's also flavor blind. It's an exchange of a Z boson. So muon, tau, and electron neutrinos all interact the same way through this mechanism. The challenge is that the neutrino is very light and the nucleus is very heavy. So this interaction that scatters off the nucleus only imparts a very small energy to the nucleus. So you need to build detectors that have sensitivity to very small energy nuclear recoils. So this is a really rich field. I just very briefly highlight some of the physics results that have come out of CEvNS experiments recently. So the coherent experiment has deployed multiple different targets, different nuclei at the SNS, which is the Spallation Neutron Source and Oak Ridge, and has measured the cross-section of coherent scattering on three different elements so far. Really exciting results in a rich program. Just recently, the first observation of coherent scattering from reactor neutrinos was reported. It's on arXiv now from the CONUS Plus experiment. So it's a new way of detecting reactor neutrinos, potentially sensitive to some low energy neutrino physics. And then there's lots of different papers where either the experimentalists or phenomenologists take these data and use it to constrain things like the weak mixing angle and low momentum transfer. And you can use it to look for solar neutrinos in large dark matter experiments. You can probe non-standard interactions of neutrinos. There's really a lot you can do with this as a neutrino detection tool. Where we would like to go in the future is making higher precision measurements, which means higher statistics, so larger detectors. And then also lowering the thresholds of the detectors so that you have access to lower energy neutrinos. So we want to sort of make bigger detectors and push the limits of existing technologies to lower the thresholds. So here's an example of why the threshold is important. What I'm showing here on the left is the neutrino energy spectrum from a nuclear reactor. You can see the flux is enormous. This is an assumed like a nuclear power reactor of 3 gigawatts. You have lots of neutrinos coming out of a nuclear reactor. But they're very relatively low energy. So they peaked at about 1 MeV and go up to maybe 8 MeV. If you then look for coherent scattering off of different nuclear targets, what you find is that most of the energy spectrum, this is the counts per keV per kilogram per day as a function of the recoil energy that you would see for these different nuclear targets. It's really sharply weighted towards very, very low energies. So you really need detectors with low thresholds in order to see this large flux of neutrinos from nuclear reactors. So one possible technology that you could use for these types of experiments is liquid xenon detectors. So these are already the state of the art in dark matter searches. You can build very large time projection chambers that fill with liquid xenon and achieve keV scale thresholds. This is a picture of the LZ experiment. For scale, you have about 7 tons of xenon in there. So you can get really big masses with relatively low thresholds. So is this a good technology for doing these experiments? At these scales, what's been achieved so far is sort of like 1 to 2 keV thresholds. We would like to go, as I showed in the last slide, below that. So the question is, how low can we actually go with this technology, and is it useful for detecting low energy coherent scattering of neutrinos? So to reach ultra low thresholds in these types of detectors, you take advantage of what's called a dual phase type of measurement, where you have interactions that happen in the liquid xenon target, which is very dense, and you have a lot of new target nuclei there. But then you can actually drift the electrons that you get from that ionizing interaction, extract them out of the liquid and into gas, and accelerate them through the gas. And in doing so, they create a flash of light that amplifies the signal. And so you can detect down to single electrons being extracted from the liquid to the gas. So you could potentially get really, really low thresholds with this technology. I wrote the words quantum limit here just because you have to, right? It's not really a quantum measure. But yeah, so you can get down to really extremely low thresholds with this technology and potentially scale it up quite a bit. So the question now is, how do you actually map the measured ionization back to the energy deposited in the detector? So to get to this place, which is the observable where you see in your detector, there's a lot of complicated stuff going on in the detector medium that you need to either model or measure in order to understand what your ultimate energy threshold will be if you're measuring, say, one ionization electron. So what we've done experimentally is just try to understand this mapping better. So we ignore all this stuff below and just look at what we call the ionization yield, which is how much ionization you get in liquid xenon as a function of energy deposited in the detector for these nuclear recoil interactions. If you've heard of quenching factors, this is just sort of just another way of saying quenching factor. The implications for reactor coherent scattering are pretty dramatic for liquid xenon detectors. So when we started this back in maybe 2015, when I was in graduate school, the best measurement was from the Lux experiment, which are shown by these black points. This is the ionization yield on the y-axis here as a function of the nuclear recoil energy. So they had measured nuclear recoils down to sort of 1-ish keV. And what I'm showing by the colored lines is just different extrapolations that all agree basically equally well with those data, but then extrapolate very differently towards lower energies, which is where it's relevant for reactor coherent scatter measurements. And just to emphasize, so if you take those three different models, these are arbitrary models, but just for illustration purposes, if you take those three different models and use that to calculate the expected rate that you would see in a xenon detector from reactor neutrinos, you can see that the expected rate changes by about a factor of 10, depending on which one you choose. So we really needed to measure this ionization yield parameter down to as low energies as possible in order to benchmark these calculations. So the way that we do this is, again, we went to North Carolina. In 2019, we performed neutron scattering experiments where you shoot neutrons at your target material of interest, scatter the neutron and tag it at a fixed angle. And if you know the incoming neutron energy and you know the angle of scatter, then you know how much energy was deposited in your target material. And then you measure the ionization, and that gives you a measurement of this ionization yield at fixed nuclear recoil energies. So this experiment was done at a tunnel in about 2019. We were sensitive to recoils between about 0.3 keV and 6.1 keV. So this is the team. This was led largely by Jinkei Zhu at Lawrence Livermore Lab, where I worked as a graduate student, but a large team, including people from UC Davis, of course, the Duke and Tunnel folks, and then myself. And this is what the experiment looked like. We actually built the xenon detector in Livermore and then shipped it across the continent to North Carolina and installed it on the beamline. And this is the xenon detector here. If you were to look inside that, you would see a very, very small liquid xenon time projection chamber. And then around the edges, you see these neutron detectors for tagging those scattered neutrons at fixed angles. So here's our measurements after we do the data analysis. The black points are data. Each one of these different panels, excuse me, are at a different energy. So one of those different angles in those detectors, we're bending it by the angle, which gives us fixed energy. And so you can see we're sensitive to like 6.1 keV and marching down in energy down to about 0.3 keV. And what's very cool is that when you get down to these low energies, you actually see quantized numbers of electrons in your spectra. So at the time, this was the lowest energy measurements of ionization from nuclear recoils and liquid xenon that had ever been done. The lowest energy that we achieved gave us an average of 1 ionization electron per neutron scatter, which, quantum limit, there it is. So this is really exciting. So we're sort of at the limit of what xenon detectors can do for detecting nuclear recoils. These are our measurements now plotted as a function of the ionization yield. These are the points that I showed before, and so we extend this down to lower energies. You can tell that we're sort of in the pessimistic scenario where you get less ionization as you go to lower energies. And that allows us to more robustly calculate the predicted signals that you would get from, in this case, either dark matter or reactor coherent scattering. And you can see that the dashed lines, which are from a simulation package that was available at the time, our measurements predict a much lower amount of ionization from the same source with dramatically smaller uncertainties. So now we can more robustly predict what we would actually see in such an experiment. Okay, so is this as far as xenon detectors can go? We've shown that nuclear recoils below 300 eV will not create ionization in liquid xenon detectors. So is that the fundamental limit of this detector technology? Maybe not. So there's this thing called the Migdal effect, which I'll explain on the next slide, that may allow us to reduce the threshold even further. The Migdal effect is this idea that when you have a nuclear recoil, what's actually going on inside that atom is you're suddenly boosting the nucleus relative to the electron cloud. And so suddenly when this scattering happens, that nucleus is no longer in an eigenstate of this, the electrons are no longer in an eigenstate of that atom. And so as they sort of catch up and settle back into their states, there's some probability that you'll actually ionize one of those electrons and knock it off. And then if you ionize an inner shell electron, then you have a vacancy that then fills through the emission of X-rays or Auger electrons. And even if you have very low energy nuclear recoils, those vacancies in different atoms can be high enough in energy that you actually see a signal above your threshold in a detector like a xenon detector. So this is a plot from a paper that was published in 2018, a theory paper, showing sort of how this would work. So this is a prediction of 2 GeV, relatively light dark matter particle scattering in a xenon target. The nuclear recoils from that signal would be down here, this gray region. So all below 0.1 eV, so totally invisible to a xenon ionization detector. But then the predicted signals from this Migdal effect give you energy deposits that, while they're very suppressed in the rate, can have energies high enough to be above like a 1 keV detection threshold. So this would enable detectors to see these ultra low energy nuclear recoils and maybe be able to detect things like coherent scattering and dark matter at dramatically reduced thresholds. But, sorry.
I must just not understand the plot. If the nuclear recoil energy is this brown black curve, how is it exciting the Migdal signals, which have a higher energy? I'm thinking of the nuclear recoil as the available energy for.
Yeah, so it's actually it's sort of an inelastic scattering process. So you're getting more energy from the incoming particle.
Got it.
Okay, so you can, despite the fact that nobody's actually seen this effect, the Migdal effect, people are using it to explain experimental results already and actually set the most stringent limits on dark matter particles at low masses. So this is a plot from the Panda X publication from 2023, which sets the most stringent limits on dark matter in this below 1 GeV mass range, but assumes that the Migdal effect exists. In the coherent scattering world, this effect was invoked to explain some controversial results where the detection of reactor neutrinos was claimed, but other people think that's not really the case. So measuring the Migdal effect and actually understanding how strong it is or whether or not it exists at all, I think it will shed light on how sensitive these types of experiments actually are. So what we were trying to do is basically a repetition of the experiment that we ran at Tunnel, where we create lots of nuclear recoils and fixed energy in a detector using neutron scattering. The difference is that with the Migdal effect, you have this nuclear recoil, but then also the Auger or X-ray gives you an electronic signal, what we call the electron recoil. And so in these detectors, in liquid xenon detectors, you can separate those two signals through the ratio of the scintillation light measured compared to the ionized charge. So that actually separates nuclear recoils from electron recoils in this two-dimensional parameter space. So if you're only seeing nuclear recoils from the neutron scattering, you're creating a lot of events in this red region. And then if you look for the Migdal effect, what you're looking for is some small population of events up here and make this two-dimensional plot. So the experiment that we did here was actually conducted at Lawrence Livermore National Lab. We had a DT neutron generator, which generates neutrons at 14 eV, scatters them at a fixed angle. And in this particular case, we're just trying to collect as many nuclear recoils as possible because the predicted rate of Migdal signals relative to the elastic scattering rate is quite low. So we just have a generator, we just run it for as long as possible, scattering neutrons off of this thing and detecting them at a fixed angle. And in this case, we have an array of neutron detectors, but they're all at the same angle. So we have this like circle of detectors to see the neutrons. Very similar team to our tonal measurements, again, led by Jinka at Lawrence Livermore, but now with some new collaborators at Berkeley and Stony Brook. These guys are the theorists who are interested in low mass dark matter searches and helped us calculate the signal model for this experiment. What it actually looked like, this is the Geant4 geometry, which I show first because it's a little bit easier to see everything. There's the neutron generator, a big block of water shielding that collimates those neutrons into a beam, our xenon detector, and then our ring of neutron detectors over here. And here's what the experiment actually looks like in real life. You can't see the xenon detector because it's behind this plate that we use to hold the neutron detectors. And then here's this big water brick that forms our beam. So what we expect to see in this experiment, we can see from our simulations, the nuclear recoil distribution as a function of energy. We would see a large peak of pure single scatters because we're tagging at a fixed angle. So we would see largely events at the same energy. But then we have backgrounds that come from cases where the neutron scatters in the xenon, but then somewhere else, which changes the amount of energy deposited in the xenon because you're tagging at a fixed angle. You no longer have that angular information, so you get a broad energy spectrum. And then also cases where the neutron scatters multiple times in the xenon itself. Also does the same thing where it sort of scrambles your angular information and then you get a broad energy spectrum from those events. So these are the backgrounds that we want to see. Here in this two-dimensional plane of scintillation versus ionization, the blue distribution shows up here. It's quite localized. Those two background distributions show up as extended in this space. So we can use this two-dimensional analysis to constrain them in these sorts of sideband regions. And then the Migdal signal, which is just taking these nuclear recoils and adding a little bit of energy from an Auger electron or an X-ray, shifts the signal up here. And so we're looking for a population of events just above the blue distribution to find evidence of the Migdal signal. We performed the experiment. We ended up with 300,000 neutron scattering events that passed our sort of analysis quality cuts. With that number of events, you predict about 200 M-shell Migdal events in this event sample. That would show up here in this parameter space. This is the same plot of scintillation versus ionization, where this distribution is our data. So we're looking for an excess of 200 events in the region shown by the black contours. What do you think? Yes, I see a thumbs down. All right. Yeah, so indeed, when you actually do this analysis, so we did this full simulation, we did a two-dimensional fit of all of our background and signal PDFs to these data. And we find essentially no evidence of any signal consistent with the Migdal effect. So, and we think we had pretty good sensitivity. So here's a plot. So we do the analysis in 2 dimensions, but just because it's hard to visualize different PDFs in 2 dimensions, we also, show a slice, which shows the different background distributions here. The Migdal signal that you would predict just based on the theory calculations is shown by the dashed red line. And like, oh, there's nothing there, right? So the best fit that we see is shown by the solid red line, about an order of magnitude smaller than the prediction. and actually consistent with zero statistically. So we see no evidence of these events in the data. However, there's a big caveat. And so there's possibly systematic effects in this particular experiment that we didn't anticipate that could basically mean that we don't have any constraining power at all. Well, the first thing you can think of, maybe Migdal effect doesn't exist, which would be really interesting because it invalidates all these dark matter limits that people have made. But there's this possibility, after we sort of got these results out in the community, people pointed out that there's possibility of a systematic in how you get ionization and scintillation in this experiment that could move the signal region that we were looking into this region where we have lots and lots of background. And the idea here is that, so when you have these interactions in the detector, you have a track from the nuclear recoil, which has, ionizing the xenon, and then a track from the Auger electron, which is also ionizing the xenon. And if you have enhanced recombination between these two tracks of the electrons and ions, you take signals that you would observe as ionization and you turn them into signals that you now observe as scintillation. So this is a little bit subtle, but basically what it's saying is that there could be xenon, how xenon signals are produced in liquid xenon that take the Migdal signals and move them into a place where we would be totally blind in this specific experiment. So in this scenario, Migdal could still be a useful thing for dark matter, and our experiment is not very interesting. The way you can get around that is by creating an experiment where you have no ionization from the nuclear recoil. So very low energy nuclear recoils, which is sort of what you would look for in the dark matter experiments anyway. So we're doing some follow-up measurements right now with lower energy neutrons. It's a little bit harder, so we're sort of now doing the simulations to try and see how you actually execute this. But we're hoping we can answer this question soon. Okay, so I have like maybe 5 minutes to talk about some additional stuff that we're just getting started with in our group, precision measurements of electron capture and beta decay to look for evidence of new physics in the neutrino sector. So in particular, we are joining a collaboration called the BEAST, which is looking for very low energy nuclear recoils, making precision measurements of those to constrain the presence of sterile neutrinos. So the way that this experiment works is you have superconducting tunnel junctions, these very low threshold sensors. You can implant radioactive isotopes into them by taking them to some exotic beam facility and putting them in a beam of radioactive nuclei. And then when those radioactive isotopes decay in the sensor, the neutrino exits the detector, but recoils against the nucleus. And you can measure that nuclear recoil with very low threshold sensors. And that nuclear recoil breaks Cooper pairs in the superconducting detector medium, which then you read out as a current through the superconducting tunnel junction. So the reason that you would want to use superconductors for this measurement is in this particular case, you're looking for very low energy signals, so 50 eV roughly. And normal ionization detectors aren't going to give you the resolution you need to do good measurements of the spectrum. And so by using superconductors, you're now breaking Cooper pairs, and the pair breaking energy of the superconductor is at the milli eV scale. So now you can really get a big signal for a very low energy interaction. The way that the experiment looks for sterile neutrinos is by measuring the two-body decay of electron capture, where you have an electron captured and it basically is just a neutrino recoiling against the nucleus in the final state. That energy of the recoiling nucleus, the way that you calculate that contains a term that's equal to the mass of the neutrino. So in most cases, we can approximate neutrinos as massless particles. So we just set that to 0. But if there are heavy sterile neutrinos that mix with some mixture into the active neutrino states, then you would basically see a shift in the recoil energy. You'd see a copy of that energy spectrum shifted in energy to lower energy. And that would give you evidence of some heavier neutrino state mixing with the active neutrinos in that decay. So this is a very powerful technique for looking for sterile neutrinos. The first measurements that the BEAST published in 2021 set world-leading limits on the presence of sterile neutrinos in the energy range between about 100 keV to 1 MeV. However, there's some unexplained systematics in these measurements that are limiting the sensitivity to going much beyond that. And so in particular, here's the actual data from a recent publication from the collaboration showing the energy spectrum that you measure. The blue is the model of the nuclear recoils. And then the gray here is a calibration spectrum, which you get from just shooting laser photons at the detector. And so the photons have an energy of something like 3 eV. So each one of these peaks is some n number of photons hitting the detector, giving you a quantum of that energy. What you can notice immediately from the spectrum is that the energy resolution, your ability to resolve those individual peaks, for the photons is much better than the energy resolution of the nuclear recoil signals. And if you're looking for a shifted copy of this spectrum, if you have a small shift and that peak is very wide, then you have a really big background. So it's limiting your ability to look for light sterile neutrinos that give you a very small shift in the energy. So we'd like to understand that broadening better, and that's where we're starting to get involved. Here's just a very back of the envelope projection on how improving the energy resolution would improve the reach of this experiment. Basically, it pushes you out to the left in this parameter space of sterile neutrino mass. So you would be able to improve your sensitivity down to lower mass sterile neutrinos. So there are two hypotheses for this broadening that are being investigated. First is that you're planting the radioisotope into the sensor. That process is not very gentle. So those nuclei can end up in different lattice sites within the superconducting material. And maybe the binding energy of the electrons is slightly different in different places, which would give you broadening in the spectrum because the electron capture is coming, sort of, there's different energy in the electron capture in each case. So theory calculations have been done and estimated the impact of that effect. It seems to be, at least in theory, that this is true, but not enough to explain the amount of broadening that's observed. So another possibility is that you have something like quenching going on in superconductor where there's a difference in how energy is being partitioned in the superconductor between nuclear recoils and the photon calibration signals. So maybe for some reason with nuclear recoils, the pair breaking process has more fluctuations in how many of those pairs recombine. And so you get a broader signal for nuclear recoils compared to electron or photon signals. So that has to do with some unknown physics of how superconductors respond to different types of signals. So we've proposed two different experiments at Triumph to try and address this. I know I'm running out of time, so I'll just go quickly. The first one is, instead of looking for recoils from electron capture, we want to look for recoils from gamma ray emission. That's a nice clean signal because there's no capture from electrons. So if there's any systematics in how the electron binding energies change in different sites, it should be blind to that. And then the second thing is we want to repeat the measurements, but implanting those radioisotopes into a different medium, which should give us different interactions with the lattice and therefore some insight into the systematics that we see. So the way that you look for gamma or nuclear recoils from gamma ray emission is that you actually implant a different element into the sensor. It then decays to an excited state in a nucleus, which lives for a long enough time that it gives you a nuclear recoil against the gamma ray as a separate event. So these are isomeric states that you're looking for. There's a limited number of isotopes that you can do that are useful for this. We identified cesium-136 as a possibility because it decays to an isomer in the daughter barium-136 and then gives you, it steps down to the ground state through the emission of 3 gamma rays, giving you a total nuclear recoil energy of about 7 eV. The fact that there's 3 different gamma rays is not totally ideal because that gives you some broadening. Those gammas can be emitted in different directions and you get some Doppler shifting the nucleus. But we think, based on our understanding of how that would behave in the lifetime of those states, you would still get a pretty narrow peak at about 7 eV that would allow us to get some insight into whether or not there is quenching in the superconductor. We have a setup at Lawrence Livermore that the East has used already that would be ready to accept this experiment. Our plan would be to tag the gamma rays that are emitted from that isomer to identify those recoils and get very low backgrounds and a very precise nuclear recoil spectrum. The other experiment that we propose to do is the same beryllium-7 measurements as the world leading limits, but with the silicon detectors that are borrowed from the super CEvNS dark matter experiment. The advantage here is that these detectors are of comparable energy resolution. They already exist. We can basically just borrow them from our friends at SLAC. And repeat the beast measurements and see if we see any differences. And the other thing that's very interesting is that if you're implanting the radioisotope into a silicon substrate, maybe you can think about annealing it somehow and improving the energy resolution, do a before-after measurement, and do some interesting experiments to compare how you could potentially improve the resolution in future detectors. So we have the data acquisition system. The Kerensky group at SLAC is the one developing these detectors. They run these things and have shown very good energy resolution. So essentially, they're ready to go for this project. In the future, we hope to build on some of the technologies that are, again, being developed by this team. There's development of qubit-based radiation detectors called SWATs. The key enabling technologies of these experiments is low TC superconducting junctions, which if you then take that, the low TC junction and make a superconducting tunnel junction out of it, low TC means that pair breaking energy is small. So for the same energy deposit in the detector, you break more Cooper pairs and get a larger signal and potentially improve the energy resolution that way. So we're hoping that we gain some insight with these experiments at Triumph that we propose into what the mechanisms are for this broadening, and then can build higher resolution detectors to eventually take us to much greater sensitivities in searches for sterile neutrinos. These are some wildly optimistic projections. These are not vetted by anybody, so don't take them too seriously. But if you could build a detector that was like Fano-limited with a hafnium, which is a very low TC superconductor, and then count with 1,000 pixels for 10 days at 1 kilohertz with 100% efficiency and no systematics, then you could get really, really dramatically improved sensitivity to sterile neutrinos and actually push down to where you would rule out the seesaw mechanism neutrinos at that in that mass range. So, okay, just to summarize, I know I'm out of time. So briefly, I hope I've convinced you that the nucleus, there's a lot of interesting stuff you can do in nuclear physics that can give us into neutrino physics. Yeah, with that, I'll take any questions. Thanks.
All right, we have time for a couple of questions.
Hi. So nice talk.
Thanks.
Pretty cool stuff. I have several we could talk at some point, I guess, but
Yeah, great.
one thing I wanted to say, so I was intrigued when you were talking about the nuclei shape, because I jumped around a little bit. I work in heavy ions now, and this is something that when we collide them, even though they become pancakes, right? Because they're going so fast, you can actually see you have to take into account the nuclei shape when you start counting like how the overlap between the two nuclei.
Yeah.
There's a lot of results that come out in what the shape must have been like. And I think there's never enough crosstalk between between fields. And so, I mean, from there, I don't know, for us, it's like the starting point, and we have a bunch of models. It'd be super interesting to see from the existing, heavy ions has so much data already, and LHC has collided xenon.
Yeah.
At some point they did. So I don't know if this is a new interesting avenue. That was literally what I wanted to say.
Let's chat at some point. That sounds really interesting. The heavy ion world to me is like it's a total mystery. So
yeah, the definite
I don't know if to learn more.
still is to me too, but I'll give it a thought, and then anyway, sorry.
Thank you.
That's all.
Very quickly, thanks for the great talk. I'm curious if you can say a little bit more about the macro measurement with low energy neutron. Like, because you showed that you can see ionization signal down to 300 dB nuclear recoil. So if you take, for example, 100 dB neutron beams, I don't know if that exists, but would that be a background-free measurement in this case?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a complicated measurement, right? But the idea behind this is sort of what you're suggesting, where you use a neutron beam that's low enough in energy that you don't get any primary ionization from the nuclear recoil, right? So like 100 eV recoils or something. Great. The challenge is that those neutrons don't just scatter and then fly off to infinity, right? They capture on stuff, they scatter multiple times, they excite nuclei, whatever. So the challenge is really suppressing backgrounds from all of those processes that you don't care about. So that's sort of exactly where we're trying to go. We're just trying to design the experiments so we can reject all these cases where you would have neutron captures on stuff, creating gamma rays that then create backgrounds for that measurement. Because essentially that measurement is just looking for, trying to count like 1 keV signals in your detector. So you need to make sure there's no other sources of those signals before you.
Can you count both the electrons and the X-ray out of the signal?
In liquid xenon, they don't go far enough to result them. It's just one energy positive.
Sorry there. Maybe we take the rest of the questions offline. So that's good. Okay, once again, can we thank the speaker?